It's nearly Easter time, so I thought we would take the opportunity to take a brief look at the history of rabbits. We've imposed some weird ideas on rabbits. There's all the normal stuff, the obsession that we have with giving animals human attributes, which is a bit creepy. And we've done this for a really long time. Here's a medieval rabbit playing the horn, and here's another one. And here's a rabbit being ridden by a dog who is jousting with another rabbit who is riding a snail that has a man's head. But above that, rabbits are seen as defenceless. They emerge from the dark of their burrows into the light like humanity under Christ. These Christian connotations are inventions, as the rabbit didn't exist in the biblical Middle East, so any references to the rabbit made there are actually the wild rock Hyrax. But there is a Christian connotation nonetheless, particularly around Easter, which I think derives mainly from pre-Christian ideas that associated rabbits with fertility because they multiply so quickly. So this mirrors new beginnings and all of the Easter stuff, and along Christian lines they're also seen as very timid and humble animals, as people are supposed to be. But some people think rabbits and Christianity are incompatible. Who am I to say? But the thing that I think is special about rabbits in our cultural imagination is that more so than other animals, they're normally depicted as extremely passive. For example, the Myxomatosis manuscripts depict the end of the world as we know it, as God reveals himself. But then in the illustrations they go, we've got all these creatures with multiple heads eating frogs. Let's just put a rabbit in there as well. Not doing anything, just being a rabbit. In this painting of Christ praying, there's rabbits there. Vittore Carpaccio sticks rabbits in most of his paintings in his series Life of a Virgin. And then more recently, someone put jellyfish genes in a rabbit to make it glow. It's called Alba. The problem with discussing how people relate to animals is that we are extremely silly, so we will move slightly away from the purely cultural realm and instead discuss the history of rabbits in the UK, which has been quite varied. But we shall begin with how to spot them. They're not to be confused with hares. Hares like open habitats and will run from predators. They're very well camouflaged and will nest in fields, so you'll have a little hair-shaped patch of bare earth in a crop where they sit. You see these most often after a wheat crop has been harvested, where suddenly a patch of the earth will leap up in front of you and run away. Hares have longer ears than rabbits and are quite long generally, and they're territorial, so you'll only ever get a handful across a farm, so they're not really a problem. They can be quite vicious to each other though, they box. The phrase harebrained is an insult based on this animal, which I think is probably a bit harsh because they seem fairly intelligent. Rabbits are smaller than hares and have shorter ears, and they live in burrows or sometimes hats. They like cover, so will live in hedges and rough grassland. I think we have some in our garden hedge because I've seen their droppings about 5 metres from my front door, but they're so good at hiding I've never actually seen the rabbit itself. Rabbits are a pest species because they eat grass and crops and breed like rabbits. But it was not always this way, and indeed in many places they're not really a problem today because disease has crippled their populations. Rabbits are not actually native to the UK. They died out here before the last ice age, and the ones we have now were native to Spain. The Romans don't seem to have had a specific word for rabbits, often referring to them just as small digging hares, and they saw them as a pest species as they spread over Europe. The Emperor Augustus sent soldiers with ferrets to the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean to curb the rabbit population, which had caused a famine. Ferrets are a very common way of dealing with rabbits throughout history, because if you have a hole with rabbits in and you put a ferret in the hole, the rabbits come out again. So if you pop a ferret in the hole and put a bag over the top, you get a sack full of rabbits. Right, and this doesn't involve guns, so it's something that poor people have consistently been allowed to do. After the fall of Rome, French monks domesticated the European rabbit, from which all pet varieties derive. But they were reintroduced in Britain around 1176 by the Norman nobility, who loved hunting and generally having certain animals reserved for them to kill for fun. Other such Norman inventions include pheasants, partridges and fallow deer. But they weren't called rabbits at this point, but conies. Until the 18th century, rabbit meant they're young, and today the word kit is used. But being from Spain, rabbits were not very well adapted to the British climate, so they weren't wild but were instead farmed, being kept in coney garths or small enclosures near castles, monasteries or manor houses. Rabbits were luxury items for their fur and meat, and keeping them was essentially a form of conspicuous consumption. Coney garths, or as we'd call them today, rabbit warrens, were artificially created habitats for the rabbits, and they had a few designs. The most famous is the pillow mound, which is essentially a rabbit-sized tunnel made out of stone and covered over with soil. They could be round rather than long, making use of existing Bronze Age mounds or whatever was at hand. They might be made out of a material that encouraged burrowing or have artificial offshoots from the main tunnel built in. But these had two problems. You had to keep the rabbits in while also keeping their predators out. One solution was to put rabbits on islands where populations of predators could easily be controlled. Lundy off Cornwall was recorded to produce 2,000 rabbits a year in 1274, and in 1929 produced 11,000. Keeping rabbits in might be done with a moat, as rabbits don't like water, or more often just some sort of wall, bank or fence. And when rabbits were to be collected, this could be done with dogs, lurchers were commonly used, or nets or ferrets or some combination thereof. Or you could put a trap door between where the rabbits lived and where they were normally fed their hay. And traps like this were also commonly used on the exterior of the warrens to catch predators like rats and stoats and weasels. After the Black Death and the sharp decline in the human population, demand for grain fell and its price collapsed. So rabbit warrens became a potentially very lucrative form of agricultural diversification for struggling landlords. But at this time they were still a luxury item, with the added bonus of being a very productive use of marginal land. Rubbishy grassland, steep and rocky, only useful otherwise for a handful of sheep and cattle, could be very productive with rabbits. But the medieval feudal system rested upon certain rights given to peasants to use common land, which the lord had to respect. And this was really important, because these rights might allow a peasant to keep a cow, say, which would allow them to support their family. But the law was such that aristocrats weren't forbidden from building rabbit warrens on this common land, so in many cases that's what they did. Now this is very interesting because it's a really early example of the capitalist incentive destroying communities by leading the rich to find legal loopholes by which to screw over the poor. Rabbits graze land much more intensively than cows and sheep, so will leave earth completely bare if there's too many of them. In the year 1668, the village of Stanton Downham was completely filled with sand that had blown in from the common land that had been exposed through overgrazing. Right, pillow mounds and any associated embankments also trashed the surrounding land by taking all of the nice fertile topsoil and lumping it together. So the landless peasants who had previously relied on this common land to survive found themselves robbed of it and could no longer live in the country and were then pushed into the cities. Understandably, this annoyed people, so there were riots about it. In Charnwood Forest, for example, people started digging up the rabbits and killing them, which was illegal, but the rabbits were being used as an economic weapon against the poor. But because the warrens annoyed people and because they made people hungry, they needed defending. So from the 14th century, it became increasingly common that landlords would lease the warrens to professional warreners who would live by the warrens to protect them from poachers and perhaps make hay and grow turnips with which to feed the rabbits. There aren't really any surviving examples of this, but in Braggate Park in Leicestershire, there was a rabbit warren and a house, both being lost in 1871 when the Copston Reservoir was created. But by the 1600s, the rabbits had become much hardier, which meant keeping them in the warrens became more important, because if they escaped, they could just destroy the crops. So warrens started to become more substantial, and by the 1850s, wire fencing was common. But by this time, the rabbit had become so abundant in the wild that its role had almost completely reversed. It was no longer a weakly animal farmed by aristocrats as a luxury item. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, it was a pest species that was food for the poor. This role developed over time. Initially, it was through poaching and anti-rabbit riots. But my great-great-grandfather was a tenant at Berkswell, where the London and North Western Railway ran through his farm, and the embankment meant that the land was constantly riddled with rabbits. Beside being an agricultural pest, he also ate them, with the story being that he never took 2 steps from his front door before he shot one. It sounds almost unbelievable that there might be so many rabbits in one place, but in 1868, DFG MacDonald referred to the rabbit as that destructive animal. 9 rabbits in captivity ate as much as 2 sheep, and of course, when free, they destroy much more than they consume. A farm on which 900 rabbits are shot yearly is taxed far more heavily than if its tenant had to maintain a flock of 200 of his landlord's sheep. The sheep, too, would be useful in fertilising the land, whilst rabbits are considered of no use in this way. 900 rabbits a year works out as roughly 2.5 rabbits a day on a single farm, which is a lot of rabbits. Interestingly, Arthur Young, writing a few decades before about Oxfordshire, completely contrasts this and talks of a Mr. Fane, who keeps rabbits in hutches for the sake of manure. He has some hundreds. They are a means of well dressing 26 acres annually. He does not conceive that they yield any other profit, nor is it necessary. But the pest role of the rabbit was greatly overshadowed their role as food for poor people, so measures were taken to reduce their population. Myxomatosis was a disease in American rabbits against which European rabbits had no immunity. The disease entered Britain from France in 1953, where it had been introduced deliberately to curb the rabbit population. Myxomatosis still affects rabbits in Britain, but its mortality rate has declined, so it's not always fatal, and the population did rise again. But in the 1990s, rabbit hemorrhagic disease hit, which knocked the population back down again. And of course, rabbits are also just a very easy prey for the natural predators out there like buzzards and badgers and foxes. So I think rabbits have a really interesting history. They go from an aristocratic luxury item to a pest species and food for the poor to today, when they are still a pest species, but a lot of places don't really suffer from them, so they're perhaps more significant just as pets and objects of our cultural imagination. We don't even eat rabbits anymore. In Britain we have lost our traditional cuisine, but even back then it was still beige. The social history of the countryside has been intertwined with this animal, but now you interact with them most often in cinemas and on the packets of Easter eggs.